All right, here's the Articles of Confederation. In this prompt, we're asking to evaluate the extent, which means how much, to which the Articles of Confederation led to a successful government. So we get to decide if how successful the Articles of Confederation were. Spoiler alert, not very. So yesterday, we talked about the context. We looked at these categories of things that led up to the Articles of Confederation, and we decided on some category names. So these we decide were like British abuses of power, British tyranny, something along those lines. Here, this is about the economic systems in each places and how those were important to their identities. And so we have these regional identities that both the South and the North wanted to protect. And then lastly, the third category was kind of ideals, like Enlightenment ideas, or things that were that were influencing the Declaration of Independence, and the ideas that all men are created equal, or that there's a fair representation in government, that sort of thing. So that's all important context for the Articles of Confederation. You need to know these things going into it to kind of set the scene. All right, so when it comes to responding to the prompt here, I've divided things up into three categories. The first is just the ineffective government of the Articles of Confederation. It was not particularly effective at doing its job of creating a central government. Second is a foreign policy issue. There's weakness against European countries, both Britain and Spain. And then third, the biggest success of the Articles of Confederation was how it organized Western land and set up a pattern by which Western land could be organized into states and so forth. So let's go through these details one at a time. So we'll start with the ineffective government, which is a pretty big, kind of the most commonly thought of thing with the Articles of Confederation. It was ineffective because it was a weak government. But again, that relates back to this set of events where they were afraid of a strong central government because they saw what the king and parliament could do to them. So they didn't want to repeat that situation. So the government was ineffective. And this is really shown by Shays' Rebellion, which are these poor Western farmers in Massachusetts that were upset about the high taxes. And they had this armed rebellion, and Massachusetts was responsible for trying to stop this rebellion. And there was a fear that if these rebellions were to spread, how would the government be able to deal with it, especially given the second detail that they didn't have the power to tax, right? This no power to tax, at least for the central government anyway, is a problem because there's no way for the government to pay for things. They have to ask the states for money, and people don't like to give money. So the states really were trying to protect their ability to tax. And so the central government could not tax, which meant they couldn't afford to pay for an army to stop any future rebellions or anything like that. Also, the Articles was ineffective because it didn't grow or change with the country. It was hard to change. You needed all 13 states to agree. It has to be unanimous, right? Which is very hard to do, to get everybody to agree on that. So that also makes it ineffective because if there's a new situation that comes up, how do you deal with it? If they wanted to change this and give the power to tax to the central government, there's no way they'd be able to get all 13 states to agree. It'd be impossible. And then finally, another example of an ineffective government is there was no clear leader. So this means like other countries, when they would look at the United States, they would think, well, who's in charge? And they wouldn't necessarily know because it's a confederation, a loose alliance of states. And so there was no clear leader, no executive or anything like that could actually get things done. So these are all showing how ineffective the government was. It just wasn't good at managing the entire country. It was good for letting the states do their own thing, but that creates a problem when you have 13 states all doing their own thing, issuing their own currency, or putting tariffs on goods of other states. It doesn't create unity, and that's a real problem. Our second category, the weakness against Europe, this is kind of more foreign policy, kind of America in the world, that kind of theme. And so after the war, there was very limited trade with Britain. Obviously we had fought the revolution against Britain, and there was not much of a desire to maintain that relationship at this point. That will change later. But so there was limited trade with Britain under the Articles of Confederation. Also, there was an inability of the U.S. government to get the British forts out of the Ohio River Valley. At the end of the Revolutionary War, the British were able to keep forts in that area, which is sort of strange if you think about it, because the United States had just defeated Britain, but Britain was still keeping soldiers on American territory. So that's going to create problems as well, especially in this area that was being settled. Third is it has to do with the Spanish. Spain controlled the city of New Orleans, which is the most important port for the Mississippi River. This is where the Mississippi River opens up into the Gulf of Mexico. And this is a very busy port for ships to come in, to trade, and move up the Mississippi River and get goods up to the interior of the country. Spain had closed off access to the port of New Orleans for American ships. So this was a real weakness because it was stopping the economic development of the United States because they could not get their goods. They didn't have what's called the right of deposit to store their goods in the port of New Orleans so they could be transferred onto ships to go up the Mississippi River. And there was no real ability of the Articles of Confederation to deal with these things at all. So that's another weakness. The third category is actually a positive of the Articles of Confederation. To organize Western land, and there are two main laws that I want you to think about with this. One is the Land Ordinance, which set up the system for selling land. Essentially, it divided the unsettled territories by Americans into this grid. So, like neat little squares, and they're called townships. And there'd be 36 townships, and that was how they would sell off those parcels of land to people. So whether it's land speculators or settlers or whatever, but the government would get some money. So even though the government didn't have power to tax, they could get money from selling land. So that was kind of a major source, or could be a major source of revenue. And in the selling of land, part of one of these little blocks, these little squares, the money from that would go towards setting up a public school, which was kind of a relatively new idea that focused on education. The other law is the Northwest Ordinance, which does two important things. One, it sets up a system for adding states, so telling you how many people you need to have in the state before you can be considered for statehood, that sort of thing. And that system was still in place for after the Articles of Confederation. And then the other thing the Northwest Ordinance did was it outlawed slavery, not everywhere, but only in those Northwest territories. So we're talking about the states that would become like Ohio and Illinois, those kinds of states. And this represents a first time that a central government of the United States would really kind of do anything about not allowing slavery. This is going to become a big deal later on because it starts to solidify the North versus South dynamic that will dominate the first 50 years of the 1800s and lead up to the Civil War. Okay, so overall, you can see there's a couple of major weaknesses and one kind of strength of the Articles of Confederation. So when you go back to this prompt, you can think about how much did the Articles lead to a successful government. I think the correct answer here, if there is one, it's always complicated, but there are some things that were mostly weak here, and there's maybe a limited success. So if I were looking at this, I'd be thinking about the limited success, but mostly the failures of the Articles of Confederation.